Welcome to today's program titled Developing and Maintaining an Employee Handbook and Addenda for Every State, How Seyfarth is Making It Possible and Cost Efficient for Employers. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials along with the CLE attendance form will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Chelsea Mesa. Chelsea, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all so much. I just want to welcome you, and I'm really excited to be talking about what literally is my favorite subject, handbooks. So I'm really glad you were willing and able to join us today as we talk through developing and maintaining an employee handbook and how we plan on helping y'all keep your handbooks up to date with some of the new tools that we've developed. I do want to briefly introduce the folks that are going to be talking to you about these very important subjects today. As for myself, I do work out of our Los Angeles office. I'm a partner with Seyfarth Shaw, and I do lead our national handbook and policy drafting team. So I'm really proud to represent that team of folks that I'll tell you more about towards the end of our presentation today. I'm joined today by Meg Toth from our Chicago office, Jean Wilson from our Boston office, and Michelle Ducharme from our Sacramento office. And among the group of us, we have literally decades of handbook and policy drafting experience that we're bringing to the table for y'all today, that we help our clients with every day. And so we're very excited to be here to be able to talk through these important topics. On the next slide, I do want to give you just a little bit of our agenda and what we'll cover today. After we get through our introduction, we will go through the importance of having an excellent employee handbook and state addenda, really why any of this or all of this matters, why we take this so seriously at the end of the day. And then we'll walk through what we think are the best practices in developing an employee handbook and developing policies, really. I mean, these are the things that we really take into consideration when we are deciding what we think we want to recommend that you include when you are doing those policies and handbooks. We'll go through what the current trends are in handbooks. We know, there have been a lot of changes, a lot of developments in the world, and handbooks are living and breathing objects. And so there are things that we are noticing that really are more trends. And that'll give Jean and Meg an opportunity to talk to y'all a little bit about that, as well as some of the developments that we've already noticed for 2022. We know there are many states who have already made some, just some determinations as to what we'll need to do just to change handbooks that already exist to make them compliant for 2022. And we'll go over those with y'all today. And the very last thing I will tell you, and Michelle will help me talk a little bit about our handbook and policy team and how we can use what we have done over the last year to really help y'all be in the best position you can with respect to your handbook. And so in terms of getting started, I'll go ahead and pass it to Michelle, who's going to start us off by talking about why it matters. Why do we need a good handbook? Michelle?
Thank you, Chelsea. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. So like Chelsea said, we're going to start out talking about basically why all of this is important, why we need to set the foundation with a good handbook. We can go to the next slide, please. So this kind of gives you an overview of what really is involved in a good handbook. So it basically gives employees a resource, and it also provides protection for employers. So in terms of, for example, the collection of policies, it's going to answer questions that employees might have at the outset. It lets them know who to contact for issues. So it really sets the foundation for an employee when they first start with a company. So as you see on that fourth bullet, that it's an introduction to who you are as a company, who you are as this employee's employer now, and the relationship that that you'll have with that employee. So it will basically set that tone for the employee's experience. It provides a lot of information to employees about their rights as well, and then as in terms of a legal shield and a sword, not only will it provide employees information on what their rights are, but it also helps protect employers in terms of complying with notice requirements that state laws and other laws have in place. So you can make sure that you have legally compliant policies in place, and then that the employees are aware of that. You can go to the next slide, please. And so here we have the purpose now of what a good handbook is. The first bullet, establishing uniform expectations, that's going to be incredibly important, especially when you are, even if you're starting out as a small employer and intending to grow, or already a large employer with a large workforce. You have these uniform expectations that apply to every employee, and every employee is going to be aware of them because it's in front of them in writing. So that's incredibly important when you are putting together a handbook, because it provides employees with a place that they can go for what the expectations are. And it gives them, as you can see on that fourth bullet, the consistency of those expectations. And you'll basically be letting them know what their rights are. And you'll basically be letting them know what their rights are when it comes to a myriad of situations and policies. Sometimes an employee might not know necessarily who to contact for a question, and the good handbook will provide them with that information. So you'll, as that fourth or fifth bullet says, you'll reduce the excessive supervisory discretion necessary there. So again, at the very end, it's not intended to be a contract with employees, but what the purpose is to provide them with the information that they need in terms of what their employment is going to look like with you as their employer. It will give them that reliable guidepost. You can go to the next slide, please. So this one's important. Why do we need written policies here? Why can't we just have them not in writing? First, some state laws require you to provide employees with notice of certain policies, and if that is the case, we want to make sure that that's compliant with the state law and then included in either the addenda or the handbook. So there is sometimes a requirement to have a written policy. Sometimes, even if there's not a requirement, there is a best practice that we might recommend, because although perhaps not required to be in writing, it might be incredibly helpful to put a particular policy in writing so that an employee is aware of it at the outset, and there's no question as to how that policy is going to apply to the employee or what the employer is going to do. So that can be really important, even if a state or statute or law doesn't have a specific written policy requirement. There could also be a new or different practice. So you might have a practice in place and decide to change that practice. The best way to do that is to put that in writing and to let your employees know that a change is in place. And once that's in writing, and we can talk about the acknowledgement in a little while, but once all of that takes place, it's a much better record for the employer to have shown that there was a change and the change was implemented and the employee acknowledged it. And then sometimes things go wrong. Perhaps an employee wasn't aware of how a policy was being implemented or handled by an employer. And the best way to clarify that, and sometimes litigation could ensue as a result, but to prevent that or clarify if that does happen, you can put that in writing and have a written policy in place. So that kind of summarizes the shield and the sword, which we touched on earlier, which is basically provides employees with what the policies are and also protects the employer in terms of either letting the employee know so that there is no confusion or complying with laws. You can go to the next slide, please. So the little light reading. So this is basically what our team has been doing, as we've been looking at all of the laws that are covering all of the states that you might need an addenda for or your main employee handbook for. This isn't necessarily meant to be an exhaustive list, but it gives you a really good idea of everything that goes into developing a compliant policy or a policy that provides your employees with the information that they need for their employment relationship with you as an employer. So there is a lot that is considered when it comes to putting a handbook or an addenda together. So we wanted to just kind of give you an example of the many resources that you can look at or that we as our team have already looked at. can go to the next slide. So what should we tell people? This is basically, like the first bullet says, what do employees need to know to be able to take advantage of this benefit, follow this rule, not get in trouble. So these are the eligibility, rights, responsibilities, consequences, resources. Your policies will convey all of this to your employees in a handbook. As an example, in perhaps a discrimination situation, employee might feel or believe that they have a situation in which they are being discriminated or they're observing discrimination, your employee handbook will let them know what the employer's policy is, who is covered by the policy, what an employee needs to do to report a situation, and to whom that situation needs to be reported to, oftentimes with more than one resource when it comes to a sexual harassment or a discrimination situation. So this handbook and addenda, that's going to provide all of the information that an employee might need at their fingertips in order to address a situation when they might not necessarily know. And sometimes we get a situation where it might be their supervisor that they have a concern with, and the handbook will let them know who else that they can contact for that. So with this, I'll give it back to Chelsea so she can discuss the handbook best practices.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. That was really helpful context. I get that question all the time of why do we need this in writing? Or what do I need to be thinking about when I'm drafting it? And you did a really nice job of summarizing some of that to plant those seeds of context in the minds of our clients. I do want to talk about handbook best practices because I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've certainly seen things that I wish could have been a little bit different in a handbook that I'd been handed by a client. And I am noticing that there are certain common threads that when I look at a series of handbooks, these are things that tend to help clients be more successful in what they're trying to accomplish. And really, what's the point if the tool cannot be used to help them succeed? If it can't be used for the things that we were talking about, that Michelle was talking about, then we really haven't done as good a job as we could have. And so in terms of best practices, on the next slide, we can kind of start at the very beginning. We obviously want to be writing these handbooks with very clear and understandable language. We want to know who our audience is. We want to know that they're going to be able to understand it. And so avoiding excess legalese is really important. The flip of that is that we don't want to get too cute with our language so that we're implying that we don't take some of these very serious things as seriously as they should be. And we want to try to clarify potential ambiguities. And we recognize that we're not going to be able to clarify all of the ambiguities, but trying as hard as we can to figure out where the language could be used against us and really work to avoid that. And there's a big difference between broad language and ambiguous language. And so sometimes we err on the side of being very broad so we can encapsulate a lot of things, but we don't want to be purposefully vague so that it really, the employee is left with not really knowing how the policy is going to apply. We obviously want employers who have multilingual workforces to consider formats that are multilingual. There are some laws in certain jurisdictions that require, for example, that if you have a certain percentage of people who speak a different language, then you have to translate. But we really approach it from a reality perspective. We know we don't have the ability to hold our employees accountable if they don't know what the policies are. I say this all the time. I am not allowed to get mad at my husband for not getting me flowers if I didn't tell him I wanted to get him to get me flowers. And our employees, it's exactly the same thing. If we're not communicating it in a way that they can understand, or if we know they're not going to be able to understand it, it's really difficult for us to be able to hold them accountable in that way. So we really should be considering, if they cannot understand the policies, translating them into languages where they will. We also are seeing a lot of movement to online electronic documents. And so we do work with a lot of clients on how to do that, what makes best sense. Doesn't make sense for every workforce because not every workforce has the same access to electronic documents. But where you do, it's certainly something that we're seeing a big move in that direction. And we also want to, when we work with clients on handbooks, talk about the process to update the handbooks without necessarily having to start from scratch every time. And some of the things we'll be talking about at the end of this session, where we do talk about the tools that we've created are going to be designed to help you be able to do that. I do want to avoid this temptation of over comprehensiveness. If we really do try to go, with the 100-page, 200-page handbooks, which by the way, I have seen, we recognize that employees are probably not going to read all of that. It does make it more difficult for us to hold them accountable or have that expectation that they will have reviewed it. But the over comprehensiveness also can be used against us because it implies we've included everything, which we recognize we just don't have the ability to do. So we have to look for opportunities where, again, being broad is the way to go, not trying to list things in an all-inclusive way, but instead giving examples of what might violate the policy. It's a better way to go. And we also recommend against trying to combine our handbooks with these kind of operational procedural manuals that are really more behind the scenes types of documents. We see a lot of opportunities where employees will point to that to say, you didn't live up to your end of the bargain because you said this was going to happen and it didn't happen. And so we really want to separate what is a employee facing policy versus how we want things to be handled as a general rule behind the scenes. So on our next slide, I also want to talk about something that I think is really important, and that is one size handbook does not fit all. We recognize there is a temptation, especially if you're a smaller organization, to maybe buy a handbook off the internet or grab a handbook that's been pre-created. And we recognize that that is very problematic for a number of reasons, especially from a legal compliance perspective. There's not a lot of guarantees in that space, but we also know that even in the most basic policy document with just the required basics, there's still a lot of customization that is necessary around choices employers get to make on how to operate under a certain law. And so we definitely don't want that opportunity to be missed because some of those things are very employer friendly. And we want in those opportunities for the employer to be able to do what makes sense for their business. And so something off the shelf may not give them the same opportunity to do that. And so we just have to recognize there's a lot of customization that is necessary in a handbook. We also can be using our handbook to a certain degree, looking for these educational opportunities for our managers and human resources, even though, like I said, this is not going to be our HR guide. We need our managers and our human resources folks to be familiar with what we need them to do. And that changes from organization to organization. So if we are expecting our managers to really be the first line of defense for certain types of policies, we want that in our policies so that our employees can really understand that. So we are going to be tailoring it to our particular go-to people where it's appropriate. And we also want to be looking at the addenda that might be necessary. There are a lot of states, and I know that Jean and Meg will have an opportunity to talk about this when we get to trends. There are a lot of states that employers are all of a sudden in, thanks to COVID, and not realizing that there might be a written policy requirement or that there's something in that state that's really generous to employees that maybe you didn't know about. And so having these addenda at the ready and being able to get them in as quickly as we've got somebody moving into that jurisdiction is something really important and kind of highlights the concept of one size does not fit all. On our next slide, I want to talk just a little bit about organization. And by no means is this the way it has to be done, but I've definitely seen a common thread where the idea that sort of the most important policies or the ones that come up a little bit more often in litigation go at the very front. And that's things like at will or EEO, harassment, retaliation. And we put them in the front and we generally organize in that way because we recognize the closer to the front, the more likely they are to be read. And the harder for an employee to argue they didn't know that it was there or they didn't have an opportunity to see it. And so it's really just kind of this very simple idea that, an employee sitting down with a handbook, if we're putting the things that we really want them to know about, that we really take very seriously, like discrimination and harassment, right in the front so that they can see it immediately. It's a good way to organize. It's a good way to start thinking about the handbook that, sort of feels a little daunting when you think about trying to get all this stuff into one place. Organizing it from the top in that way, I think, can help a little bit. And on the next slide, then sectioning off your handbook into nice, digestible, relevant chunks makes sense, best sense for me. And this is just an example of the thousands of handbooks that I've seen, an example of ways that I've seen it done that tend to work and the way that I tend to recommend it. Again, starting with that introduction that deals with those kind of big ticket items and then moving immediately into a wage and hour section because, again, with my California bias, we know that these come up a lot too. So putting that towards the beginning is also really helpful, and that's going to give your definitions, your classifications, talk about scheduling, pay. You know, employees really want to get paid, so they've got incentive to read this section of the handbook. And then we can move into things like conduct, things related to our property, internet, social media, dive into our section on time off, which would include vacations, holiday, if we've got sick time in our jurisdiction, if we've got FMLA or a state equivalent of that, some sort of pregnancy disability leave or accommodation. This is a nice place to include all of that. And then I like to include kind of a general health and welfare section that can include things like our benefits, things that might be mandated by the state. We can also address things like drugs and violence and safety, and they all fit a little bit better together in a section like this. Obviously, having an acknowledgement is very important. And then the two final sections that I mentioned, obviously arbitration is addressed differently by every employer, but deciding whether it's going to be a separate agreement or it's going to be part of the handbook, as well as confidentiality. A lot of times we see just a reference to it instead of having confidentiality really heavily addressed. We'll have like a reference to that there will be a separate agreement. I'll now kick it back to Michelle and let her talk a little bit more about some of the unfortunate mistakes that we see in handbooks a lot.
Thanks, Chelsea. Yes, to err is human, but now that we've discussed why the handbook is important, how best to organize it, what to include, let's talk about what to try to avoid some of the common handbook mistakes that we've seen. Not including or insufficient at-will language. This is an important one because of a lot of employees might try to argue in litigation that there was some type of contract with the employer. So specific at-will language is really important to make clear that there wasn't a contractual relationship with an employee. And that kind of ties in with the next one, which is promising some type of permanent employment. And then separately with raises, you don't want your handbook to give the impression that there is, for example, an annual raise that an employee will receive, unless that is going to be your practice. You want to make sure if that is not your practice that you're avoiding that type of language. An incomplete EEO policy is a really big ticket item, and that comes into play too with your state addenda as well, because specific states have very specific language that needs to be in an EEO policy. So you want to make sure that you have all of the language in there so that you're covering everything that your state requires you to cover, and also that that your employees who need to be covered under there are aware of that. Promising progressive discipline or lockstep grievance policy. You can have, of course, some type of discipline policy, but if you're very specific with it, then an employee might hold you accountable to, well, you said that this was going to be the very specific process, as opposed to in your handbook, you can say, for example, that you might have a discipline policy or you might have a reporting policy and the employer will handle it, but you don't necessarily need to have a very specific, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, because it's like the one size does not fit all. It doesn't always happen when it comes to a discipline situation. So you don't necessarily need to tie yourself into a more specific discipline procedure. Ineffective or no harassment or retaliation policy, that kind of comes in line with the EEO policy as well, that states have very specific requirements for these policies, and you want to make sure that you're complying with that. In terms of ineffective, you also, we talked about earlier, you want to make sure that you're letting your employees know specifically what the policy covers, what an employee can do in a situation. So it's really important to be clear about these policies and not have them be, I know we said with the progressive discipline, you don't want to necessarily be X, Y, and Z with that, but there are some policies where you do need to be a little bit more nuanced in it, and so you want to make sure that you're covering that. Also, unlawful leave policies and then the non-compliant vacation or sick time policies. We see that a lot with policies that don't comply with state laws. Specifically in California, vacation and sick time policies are very specific, and there are other states that have very specific policies that you want to make sure you're covering, and you're not, for example, having some type of use it or leave it policy when it comes to your vacation that a state doesn't necessarily allow. So we see that a lot with handbooks, especially ones that might be more out of date. If your handbook hasn't been updated for a while, you might have a policy in there that's no longer compliant. So we see that a lot. So you want to make sure you're staying on top of those leave policies, the vacation and the sick time policies. Same with the at-will language, the blanket, not a contract language. you kind of cover that with the at-will language. So you want to make sure that you're not tying yourself into some type of just overarching, not a contract policy. And then finally, the insufficient meal and rest break policy, that kind of ties in with the vacation and sick time or leave policies. You really want to make sure that you have those policies that are legally compliant. Many states have very specific meal and rest break policies, so you want to make sure that you have those in place. And that can come up a lot when an employee says that they missed a meal break or they missed a rest break, and you want to make sure that your policy is covering that, it's compliant with the state law, and also it lets an employee know what is expected of them when it comes to meal and rest break policies. On the next slide, we have a few more common handbook mistakes that we can discuss. Like Chelsea was mentioning earlier, not tailoring your handbook to your business it's really important, because you might have some very specific nuances with your organization that you need to convey to your employees. So you can't just necessarily take a handbook and throw it at your employees and say, okay, this is it. You need to make sure that you're really tailoring it specifically to your business, your needs, and what your employees' expectations are. Conferring excessive rights is an important thing to think about, because while the law requires certain policies, you don't necessarily have to go beyond those policies if it doesn't suit your needs and it's not necessary for your employees' protection as well. So it's important that we don't cross that line. It's a fine line. We can go up to it, but we want to make sure we're not crossing and giving too much, because that can then technically be used against you in certain situations. You want to be really careful about that. That kind of goes with the next one, is trying to address all issues. You can have catch-all languages for certain situations, but you don't need to address every very specific situation in your handbook, which we can get to. If you get to the 200-page handbook, like Chelsea had mentioned earlier, trying to address everything could end up being overwhelming for your employees, and they'll end up maybe not paying attention to those very important policies that they should be. And then the last one is very important: missing state law, municipal ordinance, or multi-jurisdictional issues. There are so many nuances in states, and that's one of the things our team is really focused on. For each of the state addenda, you want to make sure that you have those municipal ordinances. Some cities in states have specific policies that you need to make your employees aware of. So not missing those is incredibly important. So we can go to the next slide. We'll talk about implementation and how best to implement your employee handbook. So you might already have a handbook in place, or maybe this is the first handbook that you're putting together. But one of the best ways to do this is to let your employees know about this. You want to provide the written notice announcing the reissuance or issuance of your handbook, and you can do that via email to your employees. If your employees have email, you can do that via a meeting where your managers sit down with your employees, and you can cover either the fact that there is now a handbook in place or relevant changes that took place in the handbook. So it's really important that you're communicating this to your employees and not just maybe putting it on your intranet and just leaving it there. So it's important that you have some type of communication to your employees. And if you are going to have a meeting, that you're tracking that attendance. That's going to be really important too, and we'll get to this in a second, is for making sure that you have a record that your employees received the handbook, that they received information about any changes to the handbook. That's incredibly important, because employees down the road can say, well, I didn't know. And we want to make sure we can say, well, you did, because we had this meeting, you signed this attendance tracker. So it's important for both the employee and the employer to make sure that we're tracking that. And you want to make sure that your employees receive a copy of it, and we'll get into the acknowledgement as well. And then in terms of addressing the bilingual workforce, you want to make sure, like Chelsea was mentioning earlier, that we are translating it if there is a need to do that. There are some workforces that's going to be a requirement, so that they can't necessarily say that they didn't understand or they didn't receive something that they could understand. That's important as well. Okay, and so on the next slide, we can talk more about the implementation as well. So the acknowledgement, like I was talking about earlier, we see this a lot in litigation, where we have this great handbook in place, we've implemented it really well, it's got all the policies that we need, and then employees say, well, I didn't know about it. And we'll pull up the acknowledgement when we don't have one. they didn't sign it or we didn't have a record of it. So I can't stress you enough, it's really important to make sure that your employees sign this acknowledgement, keep it in their personnel file, and when you issue new ones, make sure that you have them acknowledge the new ones as well, because if they acknowledge the one from 2015 and you have one now, that doesn't exactly help if you want to say, you know, we had this discrimination policy in place and it told you everything that you needed to do, and if they didn't do it, they might easily be able to say, well, I didn't know, and if they didn't sign the acknowledgement, then that's where we are, and it's an unfortunate situation sometimes. So we can avoid that by having that acknowledgement, which is really important. And the acknowledgement, like the slide says, it's going to be Exhibit A and a claim regarding a company policy. So it's really helpful to have your policies in place and then also make sure that your employees are aware of that. Okay, on the next slide, we've got some more implementation mistakes. So on the not finalizing and comprehensively implementing the handbook. So like the previous slide was touching on, we have this great handbook and we just really want to make sure that we're conveying that really well to employees. Be available to your employees so that if they do have questions about certain policies that they know who they can talk to. Having that meeting where you're talking about changes or you're talking about the policies that were implemented is really important for your employees, and they can be comfortable with the handbook as well. So when you're implementing this handbook, you're available to them so that they know that there is a resource that they can go to. Reliance on the policy when there isn't one, or not following the policy can be another implementation mistake. So reliance on a policy when there isn't one, that just kind of goes into making sure that the policies are in your handbook, and then also when they are in your handbook that we're following them the way that they should be. You want to make sure that your managers know, like we were talking about earlier, that your managers know if there's a specific meal break policy that's being followed and they're not going rogue and deciding to let employees do something different than what the policy says. That's an important one. And then not updating your handbook. That's one of the things that I think our team is doing a wonderful job with, is letting us facilitate updating handbooks so that they're complying with the laws that are coming up and the laws that are being implemented in states across the nation. So you want to make sure that once you do have your excellent handbook in place, that you're staying on top of that and you're making sure you're updating everything, because it's only as good as the new laws that are coming out. And using the handbook as a procedure manual for managers, you want your managers to know what the procedure is, but you also want to separately help your managers in terms of managing their workforce. So this handbook isn't your manager's procedure manual. Of course, it tells them what the policies are, which is really important, that you don't want to just use that as your manager's resource. This is a resource for your employees so they know what policies cover them, what the employer's policies are. And then kind of tying that all together, a lack of coordination either within the handbook or with other documents. If you're referencing documents outside the handbook, you want to make sure that those are available to the employees, that those have also been given to the employees. And the handbook also has policies that tie in with each other and that they're not contradicting each other. Okay, actually I'm going to turn it back, to Megan and Jean so they can talk about the trends now.
Thanks very much. I'm going to spend about the next 10 minutes talking about what we're seeing in handbook trends. And on the next slide, the first thing I thought we'd talk about is sort of what is driving those trends. And the first thing we see is a change in administration. So about every 4 or 8 years, we typically have some sort of change, and that often drives changes to the law, which in turn drives changes to our policies. We do anticipate, given that we have a Democratic administration right now, that we're going to see more activity from the EEOC, from the National Labor Relations Board, from the Department of Labor, and likely maybe some initiatives such as paid family leave on the federal level that may then cause us to have to change some policies in our handbook. One of the other drivers is social and political issues. So we're seeing more and more of that spill over into the workplace and in turn affect stances that employers are taking. So for instance, the Me Too movement, that led to a increased focus on sexual harassment and gender discrimination. That in turn led to some state legislatures changing or updating their laws relating to harassment, and that meant that we needed to change our policies to reflect those things. As Meg's going to talk about, there's changes to the law, and then that, of course, will drive changes to your policies. And then one of the big things is how we work now, which has just changed dramatically since the pandemic. One of the things that Chelsea mentioned, which I think is really important, is that we have employees working in states that we don't have operations, where we never had employees before. And there are a lot of particularly leave and sick time laws that impact you if you have one employee working in a state. So even though you think, oh, well, we only have one person in California, that can have a really dramatic impact on the policies that you need to be aware of and have implemented. And so in terms of where we're going to start, I'd like to look at some issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging on the next slide. And there has been really an increased focus in this area. And one of the things that is really interesting to me is when they do surveys of employees, what they find is that employees really want to work for an organization that shares their values. And, you know, they want to feel like that they're proud of their employer. And one of the other things we found is that these issues can be really important in attracting and retaining talent. I talked to somebody the other day who said, you know, they had a prospective candidate say, oh, you know, I looked at your website and I noticed that you didn't really have any information about diversity and inclusion. You know, how does that play out in your workplace? So I think, you know, we're seeing candidates care about that kind of stuff. And so we're seeing more and more employers wanting to include statements about DEI and B issues in their handbooks. And we think that's a pretty good idea. And here, in terms of recommendations, what we would recommend is that you keep it brief. This isn't the, you know, the handbook isn't the place to talk about how you're going to kind of operationalize your commitment to these issues, but it is a good place to make a short statement that reflects your company's commitment in this area. One thing we do always caution is that ensure that your actions match up with your words. What you don't want to do, particularly in this area, is overpromise or overcommit or represent that you're doing something that you're not doing, because that causes issues. And some employers are farther along on this road than others. So you want to be cognizant of where your company is at in terms of that. And then the other thing that this drives is that you may need to revise your other policies to be consistent with your commitments. One of the things that we're seeing is employers going back and looking at their handbooks and adopting gender neutral language. So not using he, she, his, her, because that's not representative often of everyone that we have in our workplace. Dress codes, you know, they're used to, you know, and some of this is a bit old fashioned, but there used to be a dress code for women and a dress code for men. We've seen a real move away from that, where you're just addressing, you know, what is acceptable for people to wear at work, and that gender, unless it's a, you know, some sort of qualification for what they need to wear, is typically you don't need to distinguish. And then the other thing is you want to have strong discrimination, harassment, and accommodation policies in this area. And so on the next slide, we're going to get into a trend of where and how we work. So I think, as most of us know, with respect to the pandemic, is that remote work is here to stay. We're finding that employees are really pushing employers to maintain flexibility, and that in terms of handbooks and policies, that that means that, you know, a lot of employers, and Kate, if you can go to the next slide, a lot of employers had flexible work and remote work policies, and they had those in place for quite some time, but we really recommend that you take this opportunity to look at those and make sure they reflect your current practices and expectations, because we're seeing that often those policies now don't match up with the reality of what is happening in the workforce. With respect to remote work, there are lots of wage and hour policies that are implicated by remote work. And this is also a good time to look at those, and also a good time to make sure that your employees are aware of this. So, Kate, if you could just go back to the last slide for 1 minute. So what we're really looking at is work hours and recording time. So one of the things that happens when people are working from home is that you don't see them. You don't see that they're sitting at their desk working through lunch, or see that they're working until 7 or 8 o'clock every night. But if those folks are non-exempt, you should be paying them for that time. So it's really important to let people know what you expect from them in terms of work hours and what you expect from them in terms of timekeeping, and your policies need to say that. Meal periods and rest breaks still apply even when people are at home, so that's something you want to address in your policy. And then reimbursement of expenses is a big area, because there are some states that require you to reimburse employees for internet or phone use. We don't necessarily recommend that you have a detailed, travel and expense reimbursement policy in your handbook. Often it's good to have sort of the general philosophy you have about that, and then operational documents or more specific documents that you can rely on for how that actually works out. So then the next thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is hybrid work scheduling, and I kind of distinguish this a little bit from flexible work arrangements, because here what we're really talking about is the move that we've seen employers make from, there are a few people that are going to work, part-time at home or part-time in the office, to a schedule where maybe most of the workforce is doing that. And on the next slide, you can see that one of the main things that I think is really important here is that employers are really clear about their expectations. Your policy and your practice is all going to be much more effective if everybody is on the same page from the get-go. So some of the components of these policies that you want to look at and you want to address are, how many days do you expect somebody to be in work versus working remotely? Is it a 3-2? Is it a 2-3? Is it more flexible than that? Core hours. Do you have a certain amount of hours? Do you want people to be available from 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or 8 to 4 or whatever that is? Or are you able to be more flexible, and as long as you're getting your work done, then that's fine? Again, those rules may be different for non-exempt and exempt folks, but it's something that you should be communicating to people. Addressing responsiveness and mode of communication. So, in general, we expect people to answer emails within 24 hours or, by the end of the workday, letting people know what you expect of them and how you expect them to communicate with you. Is email okay? Instant messaging, texting. We're seeing a lot more texting and instant messaging, and companies sometimes adopt these systems before they think through what does that mean in terms of, can we get that information if we need it? Where is it retained? Does it just go away and then we don't have any record of it? So if you don't want people communicating by text because you have no record of that, you want to let them know that, because we're just seeing more and more that's how people communicate with each other. Again, there's the wage and hour considerations that we already talked about. And then I think it's important that you include in your policy that this is subject to change. And we recommend subject to change, but that you let people know that there will be some notice period, because we all know that this can affect arrangements for daycare or, picking up your kids. And, when you're working at home, you can organize your life in a way that's a little differently than when you're on site every day. So the next trend that is really a continuing trend on the next slide is sick time and family medical leave. In the last, I would say, certainly 5 years, maybe starting about 10 years ago, we saw a significant increase in paid sick time. And there are, numerous states, and particularly if you're in California, I think almost every city in California has its own sick leave law. And it is challenging. I would say sick time and family medical leave with respect to handbooks is probably I would say takes 60 to 70% of the time that we spend on handbooks. It's a really tricky area. We're really fortunate that we have a wonderful paid sick leave team that has spent a lot of time working with employers and figuring out how to design one-size-fits-most policies where you can, have a policy that hopefully will apply to 90% of your workforce, and then you just need to, maybe adopt a policy in San Francisco and Seattle because they're such outliers, but at least that really helps in administration. And then family medical leave, paid family and medical leave. We're seeing a huge trend in this direction. We really think that it is going to continue. Right now, we have 9 states, DC and San Francisco, that have paid laws. And then, as most of you probably know, there are a number of other states that have unpaid family medical leave laws that often don't match up exactly with the federal family and medical leave. So it often requires that you have a separate policy. We did think, I think about a month ago, that we were going to see some federal paid family leave legislation. I think the potential for that has dwindled a bit, given it had been part of the Build Back Better Act, but Senator Joe Manchin is not a big fan of paid family leave, given the current budget. And so, we think that if it does happen, it's unlikely to be more than 4 weeks, and it seems like the odds are that it probably won't happen at all, at least not right now. And so just a little bit more about family and medical leave on the next page. Unlike sick leave, I think one of the things that we've discovered is that it is really hard to try to do a one-size-fits-most family and medical leave policy that accounts for different state laws. And that's because some of them are paid through the state. Some states allow you to have a private plan. The eligibility criteria for every state is different. The benefit amount, the length of time people can take off, the reasons they can take off. I'm sure we have some HR professionals and leave administrators on the phone that, completely understand the challenge here. And we just think, unfortunately, because federal leave isn't likely to come into effect, that we're going to continue to see the patchwork that we have right now. The other thing to keep in mind when you are in a jurisdiction that has these kinds of leave laws, or you're implementing a new one, is that it often requires you to also look at your other policies, your accrued vacation or personal days or sick days, and make sure that they're consistent with one another, and the same with other existing leave policies that you have, that they all match up. Next slide. So social media, this is the last topic I'm going to cover. So most employers have a social media policy. What we're seeing is that more employers are adopting a policy that makes it clear that posts that you make outside of the workplace may affect your employment. And some of the impetus for that is coming because employers are getting complaints from either coworkers or clients or prospective clients that, they Googled someone and, got to their Facebook page, and this person posted, something that was, maybe anti-immigration or violent, or, they interpreted it as sexist. And, they're saying, either I'm not comfortable working with this person, or is this sort of representative of the kind of people that you have in your company? And so employers seem to have a greater appetite to address some of that. And so, what we often see in policies is them saying that you are going to be held accountable for postings that are made outside of work on private social media accounts that impact the workplace. And I think it's that last bullet that is really important, is that, you're not looking to become the, personal, police of what people are doing, but if it impacts people's work, you want to be able to address it. As Meg's now going to pick up, you need to be cautious about making those policies overbroad, because that can get you into trouble with the National Labor Relations Board. So I'm going to hand it over to Meg.
Thank you, Jean. So as Jean mentioned earlier, when she was giving an overview of the trends, changes in our administration can highly impact employment policies and handbooks, specifically when they change, when the administration changes from one political party to another, and then we start seeing changes in the EEOC and changes in the National Labor Relations Board. Specifically related to the National Labor Relations Board, under the prior administration, we were seeing sort of less or more relaxed scrutiny of employment policies in terms of whether or not they were being interpreted to interfere with employees' rights to engage in protected or concerted activity. Under the new board, we're anticipating seeing sort of a more renewed or higher level of scrutiny to make sure that these policies that maybe have become more relaxed aren't interfering with employees' rights to engage in protected or concerted activity. So it's very important, as this year and probably last year and going forward, that employers are looking at their policies, and I'll talk about which ones specifically in a minute, to make sure that they're not overbroad and they won't be interpreted under this new board to sort of chill certain kinds of protected activity, such as the discussion of wages or working conditions amongst employees. And as Jean just mentioned, in terms of social media, that's another big policy to sort of revisit and make sure it's not going to be interpreted as interfering with employees' Section 7 rights under the NLRA. And one pointer here, as we're all used to, and as we all joke about our favorite, disclaimer language, except otherwise, provided by applicable law, it is important to use disclaimers in handbooks and specifically related to the NLRA issues. But it's important to also remember that that's not necessarily going to be determinative or shield the company from liability, but important to keep in there nonetheless. So on the next slide, we will see the specific policies that we're going to want to look at to be sure. This, again, isn't an exhaustive list, but these are probably the ones that are subject to the most scrutiny and challenge under the changing board. Confidentiality policies to make sure that we're not stopping employees from talking about wages, discipline, investigations, electronic communications, again, any of these policies are basically related to how employees communicate, either to the public or amongst themselves, are going to be important to look at. Complaint policies, class action waivers, dress codes are all within the realm of the policies that are important to look at. At-will disclaimers, social media policies, and then one of the most highly looked upon policies, I think, from a labor perspective, is always going to be the solicitation and distribution policies. So important to go back and revisit those as well. And then I'm going to move on now to talk about sort of the 2021-2022 legal updates and developments to watch for. I think, as each of the presenters has already mentioned, one of the hardest aspects of handbooks is keeping up with state laws and developments, and it is really important to have an annual or more than annual, twice-a-year review because so many employers are in so many different states now, especially with the way they work. And this isn't a novel concept. We've been doing state addendum for years now because we have so many, multinational employers, but it is very important to keep up with these updates. And it can be it's very time-consuming because as you'll see, this is, a list of some states, and this is, again, by no means exhaustive, but just a sort of a snippet of states that we're looking at with recent legal updates for 2021 and 2022. And we're including both because some of the changes came later in 2021 and won't be in effect until 2022. Or they already went into effect, and they're important to know about. So starting off with California, and I will start California off by saying this was a particularly light year in terms of changes that would impact handbooks generally, but that's not to say that there weren't lots of other changes that we were keeping up with as usual or per usual in California related to COVID-19 and other issues. But in particular, for California handbook update purposes, one of the big changes that we saw in 2021 was an expansion to the California Family Rights Act, which we lovingly call CFRA. CFRA was expanded in 2021 to include, qualifying exigencies and also adding additional protected family members, including siblings, grandparents, and grandchildren. And in 2022, we will also have to include parent-in-laws as covered family members. Looking at Colorado, as many of you probably are aware of, Colorado enacted statewide paid sick leave in 2021, as well as a public health emergency leave law. So if you haven't addressed that yet, you should get on it. And in Colorado also enacted a law that specifically protects gender identity and gender expression. That was in September of 2021. And then, sorry, I forgot to mention too, for Colorado, it's important to understand that the paid sick leave law, effective in January 1, 2022, is now going to apply to employers with just one or more employee anywhere. Previously, it only applied if you had 16 or more employees. Connecticut, one of the big ticket items there is paid family leave. It's going to go into effect and benefits are going to become available starting on January 1 of 2022. I'm not going to go into great detail on that because we actually have an entire webinar coming up next month on that topic. So very important to tune in for that. In Illinois, there were quite a few changes. I won't go into a great level of detail, but Chicago County, those paid sick leave laws were amended to add new reasons for use. There's some new protected classes added. The VESTA Act was amended again. There were amendments in 2021, and there are new amendments in 2022 to be aware of, including expanded family members, new documentation requirements, and some confidentiality requirements as well. Missouri has put into place a Victims Economic Safety and Security Act, which protects people who are victims of domestic violence. That was effective late in 2021 and applies to employers with at least 20 employees or more. I wanted to briefly mention New York. The HERO Act went into place, which requires all employers to have an infectious disease prevention program, and a handbook policy is required on that. And then finally, Oregon is one of the states that's jumping on board with a Crown Act, which adds to the list of protected classes individuals with characteristics that are historically associated with race, including, natural hair, hair texture, and sort of other protective hairstyles. Oregon's paid family leave law was delayed, so we're not seeing that come into place until 2023. And then finally, the Oregon Family Leave Act was amended fairly significantly for 2022 with changes to eligibility and other reasons for use, which were adopted there. So with that, I don't want to eat into too much of the rest of our time. I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea to talk about our handbook team and how we can help you.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. And I actually want to let Michelle really quickly read the CLE code for those of you who are waiting for that.
I do have it, SS6372. So SS for Seyfarth Shaw, 6372.
Great, thank you. So I do want to talk a little bit about the handbook team and what we've been able to accomplish. If you can go to the next slide, just to introduce who we are. We've got about 35 attorneys, and we do have every level from junior associates through equity partners and everything in between. And we've got members in every single one of our offices, including licensures in almost every state. And these are our handbook and policy experts. In fact, the ones that were more junior, we went through and put them through an internal training in order to teach them everything that they would need to know, but we're afraid to ask about making handbooks and updating handbooks. And so we use this process as an internal Seyfarth training that was obviously not billed to clients, as well as an external resource building project. And we've used and spent hundreds of hours on what we have attempted to accomplish. So on the next slide, we can walk through what we're doing. Essentially, we divided our team into sub-teams ranging from 1 to 8 states each, divided by region, and obviously we put people who represent those regions in each team. And then we took some of our existing materials that we already had, modernized them for compliance through the end of 2021, and then formatted all of them so that we had consistency among those documents. And these are all built around a template national book that we also reviewed, updated for consistency and compliance. We're also creating companion documents to be able to have ease of reference, to know what are the most, the most recent changes on the written policy requirements, and even states where we could be able to tell a client, this isn't a place where you really need an addendum at all if you want to rely on your natural national book for this. We're also updating some of our internal materials, like our questionnaires that we use for clients, to be able to get as much information as necessary to make the handbook process just really streamlined and very efficient. And we do partner with our sick leave team. I know there was mention of our paid sick and family leave teams to ensure that we are getting the most efficient and up-to-date resources when it comes to those very unique areas. On the next slide, we'll talk about a little bit about what we have created. It is a completely customizable tool, so we have the ability to provide as little or as much as a client needs in a particular year or a particular circumstance, depending on where they're located. And so for clients who are looking for a brand new product, we can start with a starting price and then add per state based on a sliding scale based on the state's complexity. We actually sat down with a team and figured out on a range what states are more complicated than others. And most of the states that don't require a whole lot can really be done for a very low cost indeed. So if we've got clients looking for a review of an existing book, we're able to use what we've created as our resource materials to go through them and be able to create just a really efficient and cost-effective product by using what we've already done. It's really important on the next slide to recognize what it isn't, what the product we created is not. It is not an off-the-shelf product to give or sell. There just isn't an ability to hand over, simply because there is just so much customization when it comes to handbooks that it isn't responsible, in our opinion, to be able to just hand you a handbook for 50 states and say, enjoy and go to. And so we really can use this on the next slide, if you want to take a brief look at that, to provide a comprehensive handbook requirement and information for each state, kind of at the outset, to help employers stay on top of new and changing laws across the nation. It really will help us increase the predictability of cost and timing, reduce the time spent on fees on these projects without compromising the quality and the depth of the work that we feel is so crucial in creating handbooks for y'all. And also that will help us reduce the time that's going to be necessary to update in future years, because we'll have these materials behind the scenes that will tell us, once we've updated your handbook in 2022, what we need to do and only we need to do in 2023 in order to keep your handbook compliant for that purpose. So we really do encourage you to reach out to one of us. We can connect you with the rest of the members of our team. We really appreciate that you were willing to join us today. If you want to go to our final slide with our contact information. And thank you for listening to what we've been able to accomplish. I know I'm very proud of our team, and so thankful that they are willing to work with me on this project. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful remainder of your Thursday, and please reach out to us if there's anything else we can do for you or anything else you need. So thanks so much. Thanks, team.
This concludes today's webinar. The CLE code for this webinar is SS6372. Thank you for attending.